Well, hello everybody. Dave here again. Back to the second episode of the Bible's Dirty Little Secrets. And so since in last episode we talked about the Old Testament, I want to jump now to the New Testament. And one of the things that I want to talk about today is I want to jump right into talking about Jesus. And if you go back and you look and do studying, you'll find out that personally, I believe that the character of Jesus probably existed, but I don't think there was just one man that was Jesus. I think that Jesus that we see throughout Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are a bunch of different prophets of that time, that era, who got wrapped into one main character, one man. I think there were probably half a dozen Jesuses walking around in those days. And when the Gospels were finally written, some of the Gospels were written 70 to 200 years after Jesus had supposedly died on the cross. And I think a lot of those stories from different Jesuses, different men, different prophets of those days were rolled into one character. And the reason why I say we can know this, and also historians, there's a lot of historians that believe this, biblical historians that have studied this their whole life. They also some of them come to the same conclusion. But one of the reasons why I think that we can do this is because of one of the verses I want to look at today. So the verse that I want to look at today is Luke 14:26. And it says, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brother and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple." Well, when we read that verse, it seems pretty harsh. This Jesus is telling you to hate your mom and dad, hate your wife and children, hate your brothers and sisters, to even hate your own life. And then in order, you have to do all those things to be his disciple. But then we get other passages where Jesus says that the greatest commandment is to love one another as you love yourself. So here, even with Jesus, we get some hypocrisy. And I think the reason why we get this hypocrisy is because these stories were written down when there were multitudes of messiahs wandering through the land back in those days. And I think that since a lot of the New Testament was written a long time after Jesus had supposedly lived, the stories had got mixed together. We need to look, like I said before in my last episode, logically. Let's look at it logically. So you look back and you have, let's say for example, you have 5 or 6 different Messiah types walking around in Judea back in those days. Because back then, there would have been a lot of Messiah types because the Jews were under Roman authority. They didn't like that. So I'm sure there were a lot of false prophets walking around saying that, we need to rise up, God's going to come back and save us, all that nonsense. So because back then, most of the people were illiterate, a lot of the stories were just handed down. And so, nothing was written down. So when the writers came along, like I said, some of them 150, 200 years after Jesus supposedly lived, and they started writing down these stories, they may have talked to people. Maybe they talked to the grandson of a person who may have heard one of the Jesuses speak, and he told him a story. Yeah, my grandfather used to tell this story of Jesus who said this. And then another character said, well, my grandfather used to tell a story of a Jesus who said that. And really it was 2 different Jesuses, but they all got wrapped into one Jesus. Because like I said, one Jesus is this meek and mild and loving Jesus. And then there's other Jesuses that are angry and violent. One Jesus says to turn your cheek. If you get hit on the left, turn your cheek to the right. Then another Jesus says that he comes to bring the sword. Like this Jesus in Luke 14, he talks about You got to hate everybody. You got to hate your family. You got to hate your own life. You got to hate your children in order to, be his disciple. And a lot of people that are Christians will say, well, you're just misinterpreting it. Well, that's such a cop-out to say you're misinterpreting it. The Bible was written down. It's supposed to be for all people. So all people are supposed to be able to read it. If there really is a God, and he wrote us and he gave us a Bible to be saved, then shouldn't it be you just read it and understand it? Because we live way after this supposed Jesus walked the earth, so we're just having to live on stuff that was written down. So should we just be able to read it instead of having to need to interpret it? That's a big cop-out that I hate, that people are always saying, you got to interpret it, you got to interpret it. Well, I think that if there is a God and he wants us to follow him and love him, then anyone should be able to read his word and understand it. There shouldn't be this need to interpret it. So the way I look at it is, Jesus either wants you to love or he wants you to hate. Kind of a flip-flop there. So the next thing I want to talk about, and this is one of the things that I want to talk about that makes us realize that a lot of the New Testament is pretty much either made up or concerning characters that weren't even the main character to begin with. And one of the books I want to look at is the book of Mark. Now, if we go look at the book of Mark, and anyone can look this up, anyone will tell you that Mark, even though it's the second gospel mentioned, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it was actually the first gospel written. It's the gospel that we have the oldest manuscripts, and most biblical scholars believe that Mark was the original. It was the original. It was the cue that was used by Matthew, Luke, and John to write their gospels. So what's funny and what's interesting about Mark is Mark just starts off. It just starts off that it says, as it is written in the prophets, behold, I send my messenger before thy face, which shall prepare the way before thee. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make his path straight. John did baptize in the wilderness. So Mark actually starts not with the Christmas story, not with Jesus being born. It starts with John, and it starts with John being in the wilderness baptizing, and then Jesus being at least in his 30s coming to John to be baptized. So we must remember that Mark is the oldest gospel written. Mark was the original. It was the original that all the other gospels copied from. So there is no Christmas story in Mark. There is no Christmas story. So you may sit there and go, well, why is there no Christmas story in Mark? Well, because the writer who wrote Mark either, number one, didn't know the history of where Jesus was born or any of that, or he didn't really think it was no big deal. He didn't care about it. So it's kind of like today. Like, look, for example, and I'm going to use a very popular series of movies, Star Wars. So when George Lucas first created Star Wars in 1977, we start off, the Death Star is already completed. Darth Vader is already Darth Vader. Obi-Wan is old. Luke and Leia are both adults. And then years and decades later, George Lucas went about and he gave us the prequels, which kind of gives us an origin story. So the way I look at it is Mark was the original. And then when other writers came along, people that heard the stories weren't satisfied. They probably asked, well, where was Jesus before he was in the wilderness and was baptized by John? So Mark and Luke and John came along and they're like, well, we need to give an origin story to Jesus. So they went back and they used Old Testament prophecies and things written in the Old Testament to try to come up with an origin story. So that's where we get the 3 wise men and the manger. And we can even tell this because in Matthew The reason that Joseph and Mary are going back to Bethlehem is because of a because of a census. And then in Luke, it's totally different. The reason they're going back is because of another thing. There's not one specific story. There's a lot of unknowns and a lot of contradictions. So the writers that came after Mark said, we need to give Jesus an origin story. So let's go back, let's look in the Old Testament, let's try to find something that kind of corresponds with an origin story so that we can say where he came from. And then what I find most interesting about the book of Mark, let me skip to it, is when you get to Mark 16, and it just says that Mary Magdalene, Mary, mother of James, and Salome brought spices to the tomb of Jesus. He's buried in the tomb. And they're wondering who's going to roll away the stone from the entrance of the tomb. How are they going to go in there and take care of Jesus' body? And when they got there, it doesn't talk about an angel. It just says that the stone was automatically rolled back. So they enter in, and they don't, it's not announced. There's just a young man sitting on the side, and he's dressed in a white robe. And they're alarmed. They're scared. And he says, don't be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth. And he said, who was crucified? He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him? But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. And then the women got scared, and they fled out from the tomb, trembling and astonished. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And then it ends. And then in my Bible, just like in the online Bible, there's a little preface in the bottom. And it says, some of the earliest manuscripts do not include 16:9 through 20. So the original manuscripts entered right there. They ended right there. The women didn't find Jesus. They were scared. They ran away. They didn't tell anybody. So you got to think, when this story was first being told, and you get to the end of the story, and it just ends, and people were like, what? So did he return to his disciples like he was saying he was going to do? Did he go to heaven? What happened? Nobody liked this ending. So years later, somebody came in and they wrote Mark 16, verse 9 through 20, which talks about Jesus coming back to his disciples and all that stuff. And then Matthew, Luke, and John continued that. And they wrote where Jesus comes back, and then you get the story of Doubting Thomas, and you get the story of him ascending to heaven, and you get the story of all of these things that in the original manuscript are not there. So, like I said, even though we know for a fact Mark is the oldest book, Mark doesn't have a good beginning, and it has a horrible ending. People didn't like it. So Matthew, Luke, and John had to come along and fix it. They had to give us a prequel and give us the Christmas story, and then they had to give us an ending where Jesus is all powerful, he's risen, and you put your hands in his wounds, and then he goes up to heaven. So, as we can see, there's a lot of contradiction in the Bible. And a lot of Christians, they don't like to look at this. They just like to look at the good things of the Bible. But when you break it down logically, number one, it makes no sense. Number two, the stories are totally different. Number three, if this was truly inspired by God, wouldn't he who knows all things cleared up the stories? Because since God knows the future, wouldn't he know that someday I'd be sitting right here talking about this? And he would be like, someday David is going to be sitting here talking to people on the internet, making a video. And it's going to be hard and confusing for people to understand. So I need to clear it up. But he didn't. The reason why he didn't is because there is no God. Either there is no God or he doesn't care. And his stories in his book make absolutely no sense. They contradict one another. First you got a Jesus telling you to hate everybody. Then you got a Jesus telling you to love everybody. Then you got a Jesus saying to turn your cheek. And then you got a Jesus saying he's got the sword. And then you got a story that says that he was born in Bethlehem. And then you got a story where it's saying he just arrived one day and went to John. Then you got a story saying that the women went to the grave and found nothing and then ran away and told nobody. And then you got a story saying that they found him and everything was great, and then boom, he went to heaven and everything was perfect. That's the Bible. This is your holy book. This is your perfect book. This book is so flawed. If this book was written today, number one, it wouldn't be a bestseller, and number two, people would look at it, the editors would first look at it and go, this is not finished. This needs to be redone. It's not a good story. It contradicts itself. It has the characters, they change. They go from being meek and mild to angry and, pissed off. It's a horrible story. And so when you look at the Bible this way, it really makes you wonder how people can really trust this and believe it. I think that the main reason why they believe it is because it was just pounded into their heads since they were little kids. It's just propaganda. It's brainwashing. And I think the main thing is people are afraid to die and they want to hope that there's a heaven. Well, there's a lot of things in life that we want to hope. I hope that I become a millionaire someday. Doesn't mean it's true. Just because there's things that I want to happen doesn't mean that they're going to happen. So, like I said, let's use logic and wisdom and look at the Bible and look at it for what it says, and then we can discuss it. But, get rid of all this interpretation BS and, you don't know what this means and you don't know what that means. Yeah, I can read. Okay, I have a brain, I can read. So when people say that and they tell you that, what they're trying to do is it's just a cop-out because they themselves don't know. The preacher on TV who seems all powerful and holy, he don't know. He's just a man or a woman like you. So just because he walks around with preacher in front of his name doesn't mean he knows any more than you do. He's never been dead. He never met Jesus. He ain't never met God. He's just going on the same stories that you're going on. And he's just trying to come up with his own explanation just like you are. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. We're going to have more episodes. I'm David, Zoe Zizzles. Make sure to like and subscribe. Thanks. Bye.